Hello, my name is Anna Douglas and I teach in the School of Fine Art at the University of Leeds. And today I'm going to reflect on the importance of physical space, student multisensory relationality and proximity in developing a student-centred, collaborative teacher-student learning environment. I'm going to talk very briefly about my first year project, which I called Togetherness, which was designed to encourage fine art students to model innovative methods of responding to uncertainty and engagement and relating to the other, as well as to experience and validate their own embodied experiences and knowledges creatively together. Now, I'm not disputing the alternative forms of interaction that hybridity, digital teaching affords, but I am going to put forward that face-to-face sensory and embodied aware teaching is fundamental to supporting the diversity of our students' life worlds and their future creative potential. Now, like many people, no doubt, over the last 2 years, they've had to move much of their teaching to an online environment, and this has been particularly challenging for creative arts subjects that rely so much on a face-to-face pedagogy. And in our School of Fine Art, we particularly rely on what we call a kind of studio-based pedagogy. We teach in the student studios with them and their work. Now, I think many of us did an excellent job actually throughout the pandemic, finding alternative ways of bringing students together online and for students to actually be able to both make work in response to the pandemic and show work online. And our students did some incredibly innovative things. But I felt it was extremely important when we actually came together again, finally, in this September, that we really did move quite rapidly back into teaching in the studio. And this hasn't been easy, and I suspect that many other staff are reporting the same thing, that actually students now have a reluctance or a hesitancy or even a fear of coming back into the studio. So it seems particularly important to try and create activities back in the studio which bring students out of their bedrooms, literally, to make work in a more collective environment. So the project that I defined for first years was called Togetherness. And with a first year, as I say, fine art studio module designed to bring students together in their first term through forming creative and playful working relationships. Now, the project introduced to students Richard Sennett, the sociologist Richard Sennett's book, Togetherness, and this formed the basis of our exploration into the rituals, pleasures and politics of collaboration. We undertook this not only by reading his book, but also by doing. The first task I set students, even before we had collectively exchanged our names, was to respond to an instruction I set. In an empty space, you will find 100 large sheets of blank paper, a pair of scissors and a reel of double-sided tape. Please take 20 minutes and cover the floor in whichever way you choose. Now, I ran this project 3 times, and what was very interesting was actually how the students organised themselves without any instruction from me in incredibly different ways. From the group that really organised themselves in a sort of model of Fordism, where one person sat in the middle of the floor cutting little pieces of tape and then dispensing them to those, in a way, sheet paper fitters, and we ended up with a beautiful carpeted, very accurately carpeted space, to another group of students who just, every one of them tried to cut their own tape, every one of them just exchanged the scissors around, and actually it was a much more chaotic experience, nevertheless actually one in which the students did eventually cover the floor. Having achieved this action, I then invited the students, standing now on the paper carpet, to reflect on how the space had changed. How did it now look and feel to them? Unequivocally, students found the space different. It felt bounded, primed for action, full of possibility, warmer, friendlier and cleaner. Indeed, With no furniture in the room, no chairs, no tables, students decided now to sit down, really quite spontaneously, again with no instructions from me, and indeed sat down in a circle, taking off their shoes. The space now was, in their mind, evoked a sort of sacred space, a space which reminded some of them of a mosque, where in fact you kept your shoes, put your shoes outside before entering. And indeed that's what students started to do with each of the classes that we then subsequently had over the next 3 weeks. Students would leave their shoes at the entrance to this space. We reflected again, sitting down on the floor in a circle, what sitting in this space felt like. It was, some of them said, reminiscent of primary school, a story time, playing with friends and feeling safe. It was both new and familiar. Sitting like this in this space, having done this activity, was quite evidently prompting the reliving of memory-based experience of being children. And this seemed to have, for many of the students, a real releasing effect of creating the space for play. Only after we'd shared these thoughts did we actually share each other's names. So we got to know each other through doing, not by primarily at first exchanging information about ourselves. Over the 3 weeks, this room, now adopted by a collaborative group, became the stage for experimental actions and events using situated and relational practices that I brought into the teaching, often in fact from non-fine art contexts. And what you're seeing here is particularly this method, which is referred to as constellation methodology, and is often used in family systemic therapy, but has most recently been brought into design practices, design processes, and actually also the sort of the design, in fact, of social services. Such activities as the ones that we use, particularly here Constellation, enable students to develop their sensory perception, different ways of knowing and experiencing forms of cooperation, playful curiosity, self-awareness for their own preferences in group dynamics, and a growing awareness of the behaviours of others. In other words, to develop self-reflective curiosity and an interest in others with whom they also formed connections. The students here on the right, subsequently having covered the floor, we then started to brainstorm in a second day words, behaviours, aptitudes, values associated with this idea of cooperation. And these words were then adopted by small groups, 2s, 3s, and then they wrote these words on the floor. So eventually we ended up with the whole of the floor covered in various words that related to the students' generated concepts around the idea of cooperation. Now, what we then went on to do with these words was we engaged in this activity called a constellation, and the students had to finally stand on a word. They had to adopt a word amongst all the words on the floor that for them felt resonant. And I called this the kind of knowledge field. So what the students were doing up to this point was preparing the knowledge field. But actually in the knowledge field, they had to select a word and then they had to speak as if from the word, not a description of it, not a dictionary definition of it, but we asked questions between each other as if the student was an embodiment of the word. And in this sense, we pose questions regarding what cooperation might mean by tapping into our own subjective experience and knowledge. And this was a process that caused some students bemusement and consternation, but it actually did, and they told me, unlocked a different way of thinking, a different way of thinking through doing, through actually thinking through being. So by modelling and reflecting on the definition of cooperation, on what they felt were the necessary behaviours, aptitudes, values, they were able to explore their attitudes, their conflicting ideas and feelings about these concepts, their purpose, their limitations, their setbacks, in a way that came from within themselves and wasn't, as I say, some theoretical concept or dictionary definition coming externally, or coming from having read the Richard Sennett, for that matter. These were processes. This whole process of the constellation is something, I contend, that would be utterly impossible online, and for me demonstrates how important this idea of an embodied, relational, contextual, situated teaching practice is, where we are trying to model the very behaviours that could be experienced. I was looking for the word. Could be experienced, shared, lived through outside of college. And this is the ultimate aim of the Togetherness workshop. It also is to think about methodologies that could be used as, in fact, an arts practice. And many of you will be very familiar with the idea of socially engaged practice. And so what we're also doing in this workshop is modelling ways of behaving that are not just conceptually based, the idea of cooperation, but actually brings that into a practical, creative methodology whereby students are actually learning about cooperation through doing it. And what is more, they then could take these methodologies into the development of their own creative practices to develop as groups of other students in joint projects, and what's more, could in fact begin to adopt these methodologies as an artistic practice in its own right, to begin to work with others outside of the university and indeed beyond graduation. So I'm looking here for a sort of unification, a unity of theoretical ideas, not just experienced through practice, but actually model a kind of practice that could indeed affect and result in a mode of artistic production itself. Thank you very much.